Thank you so much, Ned, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I'm going to provide some brief context and an overview of the findings of our report and then take some questions. So Scenic Hudson commissioned a first of its kind report estimating the potential magnitude of natural resource damages for the Hudson River. We hired a team of experts to look at how we could frame and scope a potential natural resource damage assessment to ensure that the Hudson fully recovers and is restored to the condition that it would have been in if GE had never discharged its PCBs. Our research team has decades of experience working directly on natural resource damage assessments throughout the country. They've worked for federal trustee agencies like NOAA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help the agencies define and scope natural resource damages at various sites, including the Gulf of Mexico during the Deepwater Horizon spill. In some cases, they've also worked for polluters who are attempting to scope the magnitude of their potential liability for natural resource damages for different types of oil spills and hazardous releases. One of our research team even had a direct role in writing the regulations that govern the natural resource damage assessment process. So these are folks who very intimately know how the natural resource trustees look at damages, how they analyze them, and what the process is to ultimately bring a natural resource claim and get a decision or a settlement for a particular contaminated resource. So again, our report presents these independent findings, which are aimed at estimating the potential magnitude of natural resource damages for the Hudson River. This is not an actual natural resource damage assessment. That's important to note. Only the officially designated trustee agencies, which in the case of the Hudson River include NOAA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, can conduct the actual assessment. But our experts looked at the same reports the trustees are going to be looking at, many of which, dozens of which, were actually conducted and authored by the trustee agencies, some others authored by independent scientists, but these are all publicly available studies and data. Our experts didn't go out and do their own field studies or use any proprietary information. They also, much like the actual trustees, focused on those damages that can be most accurately quantified and for which the most data exists. They didn't look at every single potential injury that General Electric's PCBs have caused in the river, but those that have been most well documented. So as Ned mentioned earlier, there are two parts to the Superfund process. The first is the cleanup or remediation process, which is overseen by EPA and involves removing or sequestering contaminants such that they reduce or eliminate the risk to human health and the environment. And that's the dredging project that's taken place on the upper Hudson River over the past decade plus. But equally important is the natural resource damage process, which assesses liability on a polluter for the damage to natural resources that its pollution caused, as well as the lost services from that pollution. And natural resource damages focus on damage to resources in the public trust. This is not for private damages or commercial damages, but to those natural resources that truly belong to all of us. And this is really a way of compensating the public for all the harm that it has endured as a result of the contamination. A little bit of nomenclature and terminology to explain, what we're going to be talking about when we talk about natural resource damages. When we talk about injury and quantifying injury, that's all about the actual harm that has occurred to wildlife, to drinking water, to recreational fishing, to air, to soil. Those are the injuries which need to be quantified. When we quantify those injuries, that leads to an estimation of damages. And damages are the money that is required to do two things. One is called primary restoration, and that is what is required to restore a particular resource to the condition that would have existed if General Electric had never discharged its PCBs. And the second is called compensatory restoration, which is about compensating the public for the interim loss use of those resources. So that includes things like drinking water, like recreational fishing, like navigation on the Hudson River. Those are compensatory resources, which are also recoverable under a natural resource damage assessment. This is just a nice little visual that kind of summarizes the previous slide. When we talk about injuries, we're talking about the harm to drinking water, to fishing, to animals, to crabs, to birds. When we talk about damages, we're talking about the money that is required to get that primary restoration, restoring the resource, and also that compensatory restoration for the lost public use and value. And here is the meat of today's presentation, the summary of the findings from our landmark report. Our experts looked at several different categories of damages. Again, I want to emphasize that it was not entirely exhaustive. They just focused on the areas of damage for which the most data exists. And they looked at injuries to wetland-dependent wildlife in both the upper and lower Hudson River and what it would take to restore those habitats for those species. They looked at drinking water impacts to navigation, in particular on the Champlain Canal, which has been unable to be dredged due to the extreme amount of contamination in it and therefore has been closed to deep draft shipping as a result of General Electric's pollution, and also the loss of value of recreational fishing. While folks can fish on the Hudson River in theory, in most places they cannot eat the fish. And every place along the Hudson River, from Hudson Falls all the way down to New York Harbor, women of childbearing age and children can eat no fish. So there's clearly a lot of lost value there when it comes to recreational fishing. And our experts estimated that the total compensatory damages for all of these areas could be as much as $11.4 billion. In addition, as Ned mentioned at the outset of today's presentation, we also looked at what it would take to do a comprehensive restoration dredge of the upper Hudson River, that is north of the Troy Dam, to remove the remaining contamination so that fish would recover quickly and become safe to eat for all people. One of the reasons we looked at this is because without a comprehensive dredge of the upper Hudson River, resources with or without an adequate natural resource damage assessment are going to take far longer to recover. Removing that contamination, or at least most of it, is going to allow that recovery to happen much more quickly. We also know from conversations with the trustee agencies that they remain concerned that the amount of existing and remaining contamination in the upper Hudson may be such that they really can't spend any of this restoration money on projects in the upper Hudson area. It would be dangerous to attract people to the upper Hudson River when it's still so contaminated. Restoration projects would not be cost effective because species would continue to simply be polluted by PCBs. So in order to make this a truly Hudson River and Hudson River Valley focused restoration scheme, we need that additional dredging as well, which could cost up to an additional $10.7 billion. Now, those are big numbers, which we are aware of. So we wanted to put the Hudson River Natural Resource Damage Assessment in context and compare it with another recent, very well-known natural resource damage assessment, which is BP's Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, clearly that's an oil spill. This is a release of hazardous wastes. They're governed by two different statutes, but the natural resource damages process is nearly identical in the oil spill context and in the hazardous waste context. So they really are comparable in that way. The Deepwater Horizon spill was settled for a total of $9.2 billion, which is within the order of magnitude of the $11.4 billion that our experts estimated. And importantly, that $9.2 billion was a settlement amount, and we know that many considerations go into ultimately settling a claim, and it doesn't necessarily represent the true extent of damages. We believe that the Hudson River contamination is far more extensive, far more pervasive, and on the whole, far more harmful than the Deepwater Horizon spill, which is not at all to minimize, of course, the tragedy of that spill and all of the damage that it caused. In the case of Deepwater Horizon, that spill lasted for approximately 3 months. In the case of the Hudson River, General Electric discharged PCBs for over 30 years. PCBs are incredibly persistent. They have a very long half-life. They do not go away. We have been suffering with the impacts of GE's PCB contamination for over 70 years, and very likely we will continue to suffer from it for at least 70 years into the future. On the other hand, while devastating, the BP Horizon oil spill lasted for a total of several months to at the most a few years. After a few years, all of the oil was gone. It was not traceable in the water anymore. So a much, much shorter duration than we see in the Hudson River. PCBs are also far more toxic than oil. Oil can certainly devastate wildlife, but it does not have the toxicity of PCBs, nor does it biomagnify in the way that PCBs do. So oil is metabolized by organisms, so it does not concentrate the higher up the food chain it goes. Whereas with PCBs, organisms higher up on the food chain, like mink, otter, raptors, and humans, have a far greater body burden of PCBs because they accumulate all of the PCBs from any of the animals that they are eating, which may have PCBs in their bloodstream. And again, the exposure period for the Hudson River PCBs is far, far longer. When all is said and done, it will be well over a century, as opposed to the limited duration of the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. Fisheries in the Hudson River, the commercial fishery has been closed since 1977, and there is no opening date in sight for that. It will likely remain closed for at least several more decades. Whereas in the case of the Gulf of Mexico, fisheries were documented to be fully recovered, fortunately, within about 8 years. So again, the time of the damage is just far, far greater than what we saw in the Gulf. We also had drinking water impacts here in the Hudson, which were not an issue at all in the Gulf of Mexico. Finally, the square mileage, the area of impact, is approximately equivalent between the two sites. So we felt that this comparison really puts the Hudson River in context with other natural resource damage assessments and demonstrates that it is entirely reasonable and appropriate to be looking at $11+ billion for the Hudson River. Finally, as I stop sharing my screen here, I just want to say that while we're talking about dollars and cents, what this is really about is restoring the Hudson River to a healthy condition so that people and wildlife can use and enjoy and thrive in and around the Hudson River. I've lived in the Hudson Valley my entire life. I left for school for a little bit, but I was born and raised here. I live here now. I'm raising my family here now. I have 2 sons. And for those of us who have lived here a long time, most of us have never been able to really fully use and enjoy the Hudson River, so much so that we almost forget that we really have a right to do that. That is our resource. I should be able to take my sons fishing and allow them to eat the fish that they catch in the Hudson River, allow them to swim and wade without any fear. But we can't do that here in the Hudson River. In fact, in the upper Hudson, where the contamination is greatest, when they have children wading and splashing in the Hudson River at festivals, they actually have hazmat showers for the kids to use afterwards to rinse off because they're so fearful of the contamination. That's an absolute tragedy. And that's a result of General Electric's discharge of PCBs and wanton disregard for the people and the environment around the Hudson River for many decades. It is only fair that we require them to pay their share and to compensate the public for the lost use of that resource and to restore the Hudson River to the beautiful, clean, and healthy resource that it should be. So with that, I think we can start taking questions.